Good afternoon, folks. Thanks for joining today's webinar, Budgeting for Justice, Advancing Racial Equity in Los Angeles. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a button to open the chat room. Please feel free to take a moment to share your name and affiliation in the chat so that we can all see who's in the room joining us today. My name is Chauncey Smith, and I'll be facilitating today's conversation about participatory budgeting and racial equity. And I'll quickly run through a few logistical items just to bring them to your attention. If you may, please feel free to mute your microphone during the presentation. If any questions arise, there's also a Q&A button that you can use at any time during the conversation. And towards the end of our presentation today, we'll set aside about 20 minutes or so for a Q&A to respond to any comments or questions that may arise during the presentation. Okay, with that being said, I'd like to go ahead and introduce some of my colleagues. So I'm a policy and research analyst at Advancement Project California, also known as AP. AP is a racial justice and civil rights organization with over 20 years of expertise in policy research and advocacy. AP covers three main issue areas: education equity, equity and community investments, and political voice. Our education equity program area works to improve educational opportunities for underserved youth. Our equity and community investments program helps marginalized communities leverage resources to improve their neighborhoods. And our political voice program area works to make government more participatory, representative, and responsive to the needs of low-income communities of color. Now, as mentioned, I'm a member of the political voice team, and today I'll be joined by Dr. John Dobard, who is director of the political voice program area, as well as my esteemed colleague, Jacky Guerrero, who's the Associate Director of Equity and Community Investments. Now, in terms of context for today's webinar, in Los Angeles and throughout California, there have been landmark calls to reimagine public safety by divesting from the criminal justice system and shifting resources to supports and services that better serve the needs of low-income communities of color. Our political voice team recently released a policy brief last month called Budgeting for Justice, and it aims to shed light on PB as a means of advancing racial equity in California. This webinar aims to unpack some of the information that we shared in the policy brief and apply it specifically to Los Angeles. The purpose of today's webinar is to shed light on PB, on how it can be used to advance racial equity around Los Angeles County. And in terms of outcomes, our aim is to reach a shared understanding of three things. One is how public budgeting processes currently drive racial inequities. And by public budgeting, I mean the status quo processes in place, not PB. Second, we like to develop a shared understanding of PB through a racial equity lens, including some recommendations for advocates and organizers to consider. And third, we'd like to also share some opportunities for organizing and advocating for PB in Los Angeles specifically.
Thank you, Chauncey. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. A few years ago, in 2017, Advancement Project California, along with California Calls, PICO California, and USC's Equity Research Institute, formerly known as the Program for Environmental and Regional Equity, launched Race Counts. This initiative tracks racial disparities throughout the state, at the state level, within all 58 counties, and within a select number of cities. It compiles and analyzes data on over 40 indicators that paint a picture of how Californians are doing by race on issues of criminal justice, democracy, economic opportunity, education, healthcare access, healthy built environment, and housing. Race counts brings data to bear on what many people already know anecdotally, that generally speaking, Californians of color are less likely to have access to socioeconomic and political opportunities and correspondingly experience successful outcomes. In other words, there are longstanding and deep disparities in life chances that adversely impact people of color, and race counts provides data on that. The disparities that we see at the state level are also found within LA County. For example, folks of color in the county are less likely to have access to early childhood education programs, have health insurance, own a home, and feel safe in their neighborhood. Given these and other longstanding disparities, it's no surprise that we also see racial disparities in the current crises that we find ourselves in, that include a global pandemic, economic recession, and social unrest and uprisings due to police violence and harassment. For example, the COVID mortality rates for Black and Latinx people in the county are higher than their white counterparts. And in the second quarter of 2020, LA County unemployment climbed to 20% overall, but in areas with large Black populations and low white populations, the unemployment rate ranged from 24 to 32%. And in areas with large white populations and low Black populations, by contrast, the rate ranged from 10 to 17%. Finally, Black people are much more likely to be stopped by police than whites, despite the fact that Black people are less likely to be found in possession of contraband or arrested. Disparities like these are not coincidental. As we note in the policy brief, they are partially the result of a long history of explicitly racist and ethnocentric policies. However, as Race Counts explains, in our current moment, 4 large-scale structural factors, rather than explicitly racist policies, drive and reinforce the various disadvantages that people of color face. These 4 factors are: 1, inequitable systems that turn racial biases into disparities. Because our public systems rely on a considerable degree of personal and collective discretion to operate, they are designed to allow personal race-based biases to create and reinforce systemic racial disparities. So think about prosecutorial discretion, for example. That's one example. The second factor comprises economic developments in our state that increasingly marginalize working class and low-income people. California's economy has transformed over the last few decades. Jobs in the manufacturing and agricultural sectors have declined, while jobs in other sectors, particularly technology, healthcare, and food services and hospitality, have increased. Simultaneously, since 1990, a small number of higher wage sectors have experienced the most wage growth, while a larger number of lower wage sectors have experienced much slower growth. Since our state's working class is predominantly people of color, those Californians have been at higher risk of job loss, and they have been concentrated in economic sectors with lower wages and slower wage growth. And all of this has made it difficult for people of color to access the resources conducive to upward mobility. For example, quality education, home ownership, healthcare, et cetera. And this in turn helps to produce and reinforce inequities. The third factor comprises racial disparities in political power. Historically, and largely due to various barriers that hinder their political participation, people of color have not had enough political power to defeat or change policies that create and reinforce disparities. Finally, the fourth factor is the adoption of need and colorblind policies. Many of the policies that govern our public systems were and are developed without consideration of racial and socioeconomic disparities. This disregard drives those disparities because it results in policies that entrench or exacerbate existing inequalities. At the state level, this has been driven in part by, among other things, Proposition 209, which was passed in 1996 and prohibits state government from considering race, sex, or ethnicity in public education, contracting, and employment. So these 4 factors, again, systems that turn personal bias into systemic disparity, economic developments that marginalize working class and low-income people, disparities in political power, and the use of need and colorblind policies work in interrelated ways at both a macro and micro level. And I'll now turn it back to Chauncey to talk about how they work in public budgeting processes.
Thank you, John, for providing that overview of racial inequities in Los Angeles and some of the key drivers. Now, in light of what you just mentioned, I'd like to pose a question to the attendees of today's webinar. So using the chat room feature, if you'd like to answer, please share your thoughts in regards to the following question. In your view, how do the drivers of racial inequity play out within the context of public budgets, both in terms of budget processes as well as outcomes? So I see Jason Dawson uplifted an important point. Communities that most need it don't have access to the funding. That definitely relates to the inequitable outcomes that we see playing out on a regular basis. Folks already entitled to all the public dollars have their voices over amplified, people of color not at the table. Opaque budget processes. A +1 on opaque processes. Lack of representation. Well, thanks folks for sharing all of these wonderful ideas. Please feel free to keep commenting and sharing thoughts so we can make this a collaborative discussion and use each other's knowledge and experiences to develop a better understanding of some of the issues that are going on in Los Angeles concerning public budgeting. But one of the things I'd like to uplift that directly speaks to some of the comments being provided is the most recent round of the Los Angeles city budget. Many folks who have joined today's conversation know that there have been landmark calls for reform when it comes to the degree of overinvestment in policing and criminal justice compared to other sectors that may better serve the needs of communities of color, such as investing in housing, employment, and things of that nature. And despite landmark calls for reform and protests in the streets, we ended up seeing the same story play out, where the folks on the ground in communities of color, low-income folks, weren't given a meaningful voice when it came to the process itself. And as a result, there was a broad-based coalition called the People's Budget LA that actually was able to develop their own participatory budgeting process that shed more light on what community views concerning investments should look like, and also gave them a seat at the table in terms of shared understandings of what people thought about allocations. Okay. Despite all of the incidents that occurred, such as landmark calls for reform, the advocacy for a people's budget, the Los Angeles Police Department budget still continued to maintain its high level at approximately $3 billion and over 50% of unrestricted revenues. So in light of the problems with public budgeting that everyone has just identified, AP, in collaboration with other partners, conducted a survey of a potential solution that many racial justice advocates have mentioned quite recently, and that is participatory budgeting. We reviewed numerous programs to see what they're doing and to get a better understanding of approaches to participatory budgeting. But in general, across the spectrum, we've seen that PB is essentially a process that allows residents to participate in budget decision-making. And our survey of PB programs enabled us to identify some key steps that are common throughout participatory budgeting processes. First, a local elected official or the head of an agency approves PB. Second, a steering committee of stakeholders, such as government staff, community-based organizations, residents, and PB experts, collectively design the PB program by developing the rules, guidelines, and a timeline for key decision-making points. Third, community outreach is used to inform and educate residents about the program. Then, community members discuss issues impacting their lives and brainstorm potential solutions. Next, community members' ideas are reviewed and turned into actual project proposals. And once the project proposals are finalized, community members vote on which projects they prefer. Lastly, but not least, after the projects are selected, they're implemented, and then the whole process itself, steps 1 through 7, is evaluated for potential upgrades in future cycles. Now, having walked through the main steps to participatory budgeting programs, I'd like to briefly highlight some of the key design components that we were able to find in our research of PB programs. And these key design components are factors that should be considered in trying to develop a PB program that aims to advance racial equity. They are transparency, civic engagement, community decision-making, and equity. Transparency means the process is readily made open and accessible to the public. Civic engagement means robust community outreach and participation. Community decision-making means that residents, to some degree, have an ability to determine what projects are funded. And equity means that civic engagement is tailored to empower marginalized communities and that projects aim to allocate resources to marginalized communities. Now, with these 4 key design components in mind, we applied them to different PB programs to get a better picture on the way in which they operate in terms of their function, and also to get a little bit more insight on their purpose. And through that, we were able to develop a 3-model framework that can be used by folks interested in PB to develop a program that fits their political circumstances and interests. So on the far left of the chart, you'll see that we have a model called consultative. And there, the key components that you'll often see present are transparency and civic engagement. And then one column to the right is the democracy reform model. It includes those present within consultative, but also provides for community decision-making power. And third, what we at AP would really consider the North Star in terms of participatory budgeting models and programs is what we're calling the social justice model. And there it includes all of the former key components as well as equity. Now, to dig into each of these models in a bit more detail, the purpose of the consultative model is primarily to improve public trust in government decision-making. So that really speaks to some of the comments that were provided a bit earlier in the chat room concerning budget processes being opaque and not providing a space for community members to actually have a reasonable seat at the table. One point to note, as mentioned just prior, is that because it aims to enhance public trust, it also usually does not come with community decision-making power. And to apply the consultative model to some of the drivers of racial inequities that John just mentioned earlier in today's conversation, consultative PB generally fails to account for systemic biases that result in racially disparate outcomes. It does not aim to address exclusionary patterns of economic development, fails to address racial disparities in political power, and it does not meaningfully account for the interests of high-need communities. Now, despite these drawbacks, consultative PB does have significant strands that cut across racial lines that folks should consider. As mentioned, it allows public trust in government to increase if it's implemented in a meaningful way. It also helps ensure that residents are better informed and that their opinions are heard. And last but not least, it also provides space for locality to improve their community engagement infrastructure in areas beyond PB. Now, I'd also like to provide the caveat that the consultative model, although it's not ideal from an equity perspective, it does have significant value. We recognize that based on the political circumstances and landscape of jurisdictions in Los Angeles or in other localities, the consultative approach may not always be practical. But one thing we'd like to keep in mind is that it can be used as a stepping stone to get participatory budgeting integrated into a locality's budgeting structure. And then over the course of time, additional equity components can be integrated. Now, the democracy reform model prioritizes shifting power to community members in addition to improving public trust in government. However, it does not focus on serving the needs of marginalized communities in an express way. And because of that, as under the consultative approach, it generally fails to account for the 4 drivers of racial inequity that were outlined earlier by John. And despite this drawback, we really believe that the democracy reform approach has significant value for numerous reasons. One, by providing power to community members to actually have more influence on the budget, it inverts the relationship between elected officials and everyday people and really empowers them to make decisions that reflect their interests. 2, it also reduces the potential outsized influence of traditional power brokers through that shift in decision-making. So for example, a lot of folks in Los Angeles and around the state are concerned about the significant influence of law enforcement unions and potentially large corporations when it comes to local budget decision-making. By increasing the opportunity for marginalized folks, low-income communities, and people of color to be at the table, it helps offset that potential undue influence. And as with the consultative model, even though the democracy reform approach doesn't include the equity component that we really believe is key, it can be used as a foundation for moving closer towards equity over the course of time as political circumstances evolve. And last but not least, we have the North Star of what we would consider participatory budgeting as a means of advancing racial equity, the social justice model. As mentioned, it prioritizes equity from the outset and throughout the process, in addition to improving trust in government and shifting power to community members. In terms of the 4 drivers of racial inequity, the social justice model generally minimizes systemic biases that result in racially disparate outcomes. It reduces exclusionary economic decision-making, reduces political power imbalances, and provides space for need and color-conscious policymaking. Now, acknowledging these significant benefits, there are some potential drawbacks that should be considered and are potential arguments that folks on the ground could see in opposition as they try to advocate for the social justice model. One, because of the significant engagement of marginalized community members and shifting resources to them, there's going to be some higher costs in terms of making that budget process more operational. Now, having walked us through some of the key aspects of PB programs, steps 1 through 7, identifying the key components, and then the models. I'd like to provide a few basic recommendations that organizers and advocates for participatory budgeting and racial equity should consider. So first, if it's possible, based on political circumstances, we would recommend adopting the social justice model. And the caveat is that if that's not possible, it would also be potentially useful to adopt the consultative or democracy reform approach and then try to integrate equity components over the course of time. In addition, we think it's very, very important to understand the value of the social justice model or any PB program more generally within the context of systemic change overall. And by that, I specifically mean that, PB is usually used to determine how a specific set of finite resources are allocated. However, through the key components that we mentioned more broadly, we believe that the social justice model should be used to expand those key components to budgeting systems more broadly, not just funds that are specifically allocated to PB, but also see if those different types of components that improve the lives of marginalized communities can be applied to the funds within the general fund, can be applied to general fund dollars. In addition, we recommend advocating for racial equity to be centered throughout any participatory budgeting process. Also recommend a co-design approach from the outset. And by co-design, I mean specifically making sure that community members who are most impacted and of high need have a seat at the table at the beginning when PB is approved, also in the design phase at step 2, and then all the way until the actual implementation of projects and review of the process itself. And lastly, it's important to recognize that PB can be used as a means of facilitating movement building and community empowerment. And by community empowerment, we mean viewing PB as a way to keep marginalized communities politically engaged in between election cycles, and also understanding that PB can be used to engage folks who've been alienated by political processes. Now, with that being said, I'll create space for my colleague, Jacky Guerrero, Associate Director of Equity and Community Investments, to share some opportunities to organize and advocate for PB.
Thank you, Chauncey. Appreciate that. And a lot of great information that you shared earlier. So I just wanted to talk briefly about a few opportunities here in LA County that exist that make way for, advocacy organizations, community organizations to utilize a PB approach in incorporating community voice involvement and ultimately in spending decisions, based off of, several key initiatives that have, passed and continue to move ahead locally. Before I kind of talk briefly about some of these opportunities, it is really important to highlight and underline as well that, the political context often really does drive the creation of these participatory budgeting programs, or create the avenue and opening for PB to be explored as an option. And oftentimes that political context really also allows for either a very robust PB approach or a very maybe more narrowed approach as well. So just wanted to make that clear because a lot of these initiatives here that we're talking about, at least with Measure J and the alternatives to incarceration, these are initiatives as well that were supported by the Board of Supervisors in LA County. So with that said, I wanted to just talk briefly about a few of these initiatives. First, Measure J implementation for many of you all who may not be as familiar. This is a ballot measure that was on the November ballot that a large majority of LA County residents voted and approved to dedicate 10% of the county's total unrestricted general fund revenues to support communities of color and not spend those dollars on law enforcement. So there was very clear information, clear direction that these dollars would not be used for policing and incarceration, and in fact would be used to support the Alternatives to Incarceration Department initiative that would support workforce development, that would support youth development programs and services. So here, this is a really important opportunity because when you look at 10% of the total LA County's unrestricted revenues, we're talking about potentially up to $100 million that is made available to be able to, support communities, and that is huge. Now, we're in these stages where, the county has passed an implementation plan that requires community input in that plan. And so this is where we see an opportunity to really think about how do we, utilize a PB approach so that folks who have been impacted by mass incarceration, mass criminalization are at the table and participating and being able to influence where these dollars move. It's the same through the Alternatives to Incarceration program as well. So this, department itself will be receiving funds from Measure J. And so again, here it's, making sure that when we're talking about PB, we're really thinking about the design, right? Who's at the table, who's participating, where, using data to inform where these dollars should best be invested, which communities have most been impacted by criminalization and incarceration, and making sure those dollars move in that direction as well. And then, AB 109, again, this is, created because of alignment. Basically, in 2011, a lot of counties took on additional, had to take on supervision for folks that were released from prison or detention. And so this created, the state had to funnel down some funding down to the local level to be able to help counties cover and pay for those services. This, for LA County, this is about, $360 million this year that they use in AB 109 funds. And instead of putting them back into criminalization or public safety departments, it's how do we best utilize these funds, again, to better provide health supports and other programmatic supports there. And so then finally, another opportunity is, we saw that because of COVID, there was a huge CARES Act package that came down to California, and locally the county received, millions of dollars to be able to provide supports for essential workers and also communities most impacted by COVID. And so again, one thing we would like to see more of here in LA County is including those community voices in decisions around where these dollars are best utilized. The county has done, some good jobs with the health department to help direct and identify where those services go. But again, it's continuing to live into that social justice approach to PB, again, using equity and determining where funds go, and then incorporating and working with the people most impacted to help decide where those dollars go. So those are just a few examples that we wanted to lift up. Thank you. I'll pass it back to you, Chauncey.
Thanks, Jackie. Thanks for walking us through these different opportunities to organize and advocate for PB. Now, with that being said, I'd just like to create a little bit of space for attendees of today's webinar to share thoughts or any burning questions concerning any of the topics that we have reviewed thus far. So that includes racial inequities and key drivers, as well as participatory budgeting through a racial equity lens, and the opportunities to organize and advocate for PB. There's a Q&A feature in the control panel on your Zoom window. If you open that up, you can go ahead and type your questions into that feature, and then I'll go ahead and direct the question to the appropriate panelists to respond. So we have a question from Jason Dawson. Is the presentation being recorded? for later viewing. Yes, the presentation is being recorded, and we may have a copy available at some subsequent time. Question from Kelly Kent: is there much of a track record for PB in school districts? Yes, Kelly, there are some school districts around the nation that have integrated PB into their budgeting processes.
Chauncey, do you mind if I speak to that as well?
Yeah, sure, Jacky.
So yeah, we through our team and our work, we've done a lot of provided a lot of support to community-based organizations looking to add and influence where supplemental and concentration funds are dedicated using and through the LCAP process. I think the LCAP process, as you know, it was a new effort, new initiative by the state to incorporate community voice. I think we would best describe it, as Chauncey has laid out, the more consultative, I can't even say that, consultative or whatever approach, because really it hasn't met the aspirations and the intentions I think that community had and advocates had for how the LCAP could really help inform spending. I think it's definitely turned more into an approach of doing community and parent surveys, parents providing surveys, attending stakeholder meetings, and then at some point close to the budget adoption, the LCAP is presented without additional back and forth. We spent a lot of time thinking how to best improve these processes, and I think if the LCAP process did incorporate equity in really highlighting which students should be receiving the most funding, that would be a way to improve the LCAP process. And of course, more and long-term engagement between parents and the school district. So they're not just, attending meetings, signing their name, and then the, district can say that they met with parents and check that off. That LCAP process could certainly be improved and moved towards more towards PB.
Thanks, Jacky. There's also another question that I think kind of applies to your experience and expertise. Lulu Hamad poses the following question: how can you identify organizing opportunities if you have a very hostile board of supervisors, such as in Orange County?
Yeah, great question. That's a challenge. So this is where both the LA County example is a good example and maybe not the best example, in that in LA County we had a more friendly board of supervisors who really, I think, were also seeking voter backing, right, in their efforts to shift huge chunks of the budget towards equity, and getting voters to sign off and really show that support really does help in those very difficult decisions making process of now moving money from one department to another, because that in essence is potentially what we're talking about. In Orange County, yes, we've also worked there, and it is quite difficult. You don't really have the ability to go through the county board of supervisors to ask them to put a ballot measure such as Measure J on the ballot. So what it would require would be a voter initiative where organizations and advocacy groups would have to collect signatures. It's a harder way, but actually I think it helps build up that infrastructure that then is needed to push that initiative over the 50 +1 percentage to get that majority support. That would probably be a route to go to get something similar to, say, a Measure J, would be to go to the voters, collect signatures, and then push a very strong campaign over the finish line. In most places that are more conservative, you don't have that friendly council to hear you out, and so then going directly to voters may be an alternate way.
Thank you, Jacky. Are there any other questions out there from folks joining us today? Oh, Ed Robinson posed the following question. How do you envision parity of divergent views as it relates to organizations and advocates for PB? In other words, how will all voices be heard? Yeah, Ed, I'll answer in short. I mean, that's a very, very difficult thing to try to ensure. But I think what we do know is that under the status quo approach of how public budgeting works, there's nothing close to what could be considered parity. And when it comes to the interests of marginalized folks, they're inadequately reflected. So ideally, under one of the models that we just walked through prior, it would create space for non-traditional stakeholders to be more meaningfully heard in public budgeting processes. And if organizers or advocates for PB were able to get the social justice model adopted, it would be the most readily able to account for the types of things that you're envisioning in regards to parity. Because within that specific context, community outreach and engagement would be targeted to marginalized community members. And they would also have a seat at the table of designing the PB program itself from the beginning until the end. We have a question from Amy. Are there any places I can get training on this? Well, right now, I mean, this webinar itself is an opportunity for some basic information and training. In addition, I was going to mention this at the next part of our presentation, but we do have an informal work group composed of stakeholders around Los Angeles that have an interest in participatory budgeting and racial equity. And moving forward with that work group, there will be an opportunity for stakeholders who like to get a bit more up to speed on PB and issues related to it can join and kind of gather more information.
And Chauncey, I'll just add to that answer that the Participatory Budgeting Project also offers training, so folks should check them out. Again, that's the Participatory Budgeting Project.
Yeah, and I think there are more questions, Chauncey, in the chat.
Okay.
As well. Do you see them, or would you like me to?
Yeah, I'm taking, so from Jessica Ward Ramirez, what are the next steps in LA County / the city as the budget season gets finalized in April? Are foundations in LA part of that work group? So I'll let Jacky answer the first question. And in regards to the second, at this point, they have not joined the work group, but that is something to consider.
Yeah, for your first question, Jessica, for next steps in LA County, it's really implementation at this point. For Measure J, it's setting up the the stakeholder groups, it's setting the subcommittees up, it's getting people up to speed. Even there's just a lot of moving pieces to that. Then there's the actual funding piece, right, connected to how the set aside is going to happen. So there's a lot of things that are going to be happening in the winter into spring next year, and it's going to happen over not just by next year's budget adoption, but even after that, it'll be a while before those entities are set up. I believe even Measure J is it doesn't 10% doesn't get cut in next year. It's phased in approach. For LA City, Chauncey, I'm not sure if you can speak a little bit more to that work that you were doing locally in LA. the city level.
Yes, I would have to follow up on that specific question. So I'm not 100% sure.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think for most of these, even for the ATI, AB 109, it's there are now efforts that have been put into motion that they'll in essence are happening within the county and through engagements with community organizations and community groups, and again, communities most impacted. For you know, I think the one thing that we're looking towards as, you know, folks that do a lot of budget advocacy is really if there's another round of another federal relief package. It always looks very uncertain these days as we read the news whether there will even be one. But if there is one, you know, we're definitely ready and primed to try to support our colleagues here in LA, but even across the state in trying to, you know, be at the table, decision-making table, to ensure that there is equity in terms of how dollars are allotted. Yeah. And then the second question, I think Chauncey, you got as well.
And there's also a question within the Q&A feature from Esperanza. For folks who are new to this concept from a scholarly perspective, what would you like your attendees to walk away with as next steps, and does it depend on your region or industry? So in terms of what would be ideal to walk away with, I think it's just to have an understanding of PB from a racial equity perspective in the broadest sense. Understand that there's key components that folks should consider, and that in an ideal scenario, the social justice model would be the best approach to advocate for in order to actually increase equity, not only in terms of how resources are allocated, but also to empower marginalized communities. And I would say, keep in mind each of the three models that we presented, and consider the opportunities that Jacky just shared with us, as well as the political circumstances directly affecting your community, to figure out which approach would be best for you to organize around and advocate for.
Yeah, I would also just add as well to that you know, the budgeting development process is really flawed, as we've talked about. Oftentimes it's very rubber stampish in terms of it doesn't really change that drastically any decisions, right? We're usually talking about marginal changes. If there, you know, if there are new revenues coming in, it's just, you know, what we know already is most of it tends to go to policing, incarceration, and I think it's interrupting that often a habit of local electeds to basically just give new revenues to those departments. Then on the other end is, in years that we may be facing, if their revenue decreases, is ensuring that those cuts don't happen on the backs of the departments that our communities most rely on. And so, but ultimately, we have to look at the budget development process if we are trying to get to equity. And that's the piece where, you know, this provides us a roadmap. But there's still a lot more work to do if we're actually going to be able to make, you know, budgets equitable across the state. And that's going to require decades of work, right? But we need more people paying attention to the budget in general, just to help, again, bring more attention to that and the need to reform it.
And I'll add, I mean, so in terms of just further learning more about this concept, just encourage folks to read the brief. Also check out, again, participatory budgeting, the participatory budgeting project and their website, because there's a lot of good information, introductory information there. So you can go to participatorybudgeting.org and find information there. And then again, to reiterate what Chauncey mentioned earlier, for those folks who are in LA County, consider joining this work group where we will continue to have these conversations.
Thank you, John. Received another question in the Q&A from Patricia LeBron. I'll answer it in part and then also create space for Jacky or John to chime in. So it says, what is the process of fiscal or budget literary? How much do people need to invest to understand budgets? I think that gets to a key problem, especially the second question. How much do people need to invest? How do you actually learn about it? It's excessively complicated for the average person. It takes significant time to actually learn about the process. And once you learn about the process itself, it's very difficult to follow and track how dollars flow from the beginning of the process until the end. And because of that complexity, combined with budget processes being opaque, for example, like a whole host of factors where budget decisions are made and sometimes behind closed doors. That's one of the main reasons we think participatory budgeting is something that would be meaningful to consider, because it helps bring a lot of the policy issues to the forefront of everyday people. And it really demystifies a lot of the complexities that are involved with actually budget decision making and then following the process itself.
Yeah, I'd also add to that. I mean, when I came into this work, it's not really a place where advocates or people can go learn about how to become a budget advocate or even understand the budget. I think even within city government, you find people that come in maybe with accounting backgrounds who then enter and do the manual work of developing the budget and making decisions. But we've also, but when you're maybe don't come with that background, you read budget documents, they're hard to understand, they're hard to connect with, and it's been years, right, of my work to get to a point where I feel comfortable with it. But I will say that it is possible, but it does need to be reformed. We've been working in partnership with community-based organizations, organizers across the state, and they now understand this information just as well as we do. And that's wonderful to see. But of course, it needs to be reformed so that way it doesn't take many years of just engaging with these documents for one to understand them. Yeah.
Thank you, Jacky.
Mm-hmm.
So with that being said, I'll quickly walk through a couple of next steps. So one, as mentioned, we have an informal work group. We've been partnering with the Participatory Budgeting Project to convene stakeholders in Los Angeles who are interested in PB and racial equity. So if you're interested in joining that work group, please feel free to send me an email at csmith@advanceproj.org. Once again, it's csmith@advanceproj.org. And in addition, we recently released a policy brief on PB and racial equity in California. And that policy brief is located on our website. And it's a good resource for folks to consider if you'd like to learn more information about some of the topics discussed today and participatory budgeting more generally. And then lastly, there were a few requests in the chat room this afternoon in regards to whether the slide deck, PowerPoint slides will be available after today's presentation. Yes, following this event, we will try to get a copy of the PowerPoint slide deck posted onto the Advancement Project California website so that everyone can have an opportunity to review the information that we shared with you. Okay, so to close, I'd like to highlight that PB began as a means of empowering marginalized communities in Brazil. This history serves as a reminder that PB holds the promise of potentially improving the lives of low-income people of color. However, whether that promise is fulfilled depends upon both the type of PB the community adopts, as well as the continuous hard work of advocates for equity. From a racial equity perspective, we believe that the social justice model of PB is the ideal form to adopt. However, the democracy reform and consultative models can also be used as meaningful starting points. And it's important to keep in mind that no model in itself will be able to completely offset the historic and continued impact of systemic racism that permeates our society. Therefore, it is important to view PB as one of many potentially powerful tools that can be used to advance racial justice. Thanks very much for joining us this afternoon. Have a good day.